evening, my friends. This is Paul, and today we're here to talk about all 8 functions of the ISTJ, from the main 4 all the way down to the shadow functions. We've already done this video before with the INFJs, so let's just jump right into it. The first cognitive function of the ISTJ and also the ISFJ is introverted sensing. Dominant introverted sensors tend to have the best memory of all the types. They love looking back on personal details in their past and being able to find some way to compartmentalize and categorize their memories. Usually people with introverted sensing in the lead, they love routines, they love the past being organized. They typically love some way of preserving that which has been effective before and to be able to keep it going for as long as possible. I know for me, for example, I really love making lists. I've got so many notepad files on my computer. I have so many lists of things. I have even the slightest little things, like I keep track of which characters are in spirit battles in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which stages are in which. I have all of my favorite games written down with like numbers next to them denoting score, and I usually remember which year games came out. I love just recalling factual bits of information. Dominant sensors in general tend to be very aware of their environment, probably the most aware of what's going on around them out of all the types. Typically speaking, if you have to point something out and say, "Ooh, look at how pretty that is," to a dominant sensor, pretty much all of them will say, "Yeah, I know. I saw that way long ago. I don't know why it took you so long." But what separates the ISTJ and the ISFJ is that they naturally contrast what they're noticing with what they've noticed. So for instance, if an ISTJ sees like a friend, they might instantly find some way to compare that friend to someone they met before. Or if it's been several years, they might be able to immediately point out, oh, this part of you has changed, or maybe you've gained weight, maybe you've lost weight, maybe you've grown, maybe you've shrunk, maybe your posture has changed. They're typically able to recall all of that really quickly, whereas it might take some other types a bit of time and introspection to come to those conclusions. So you can usually tell if someone's an ISTJ or an ISFJ if they are really dead set determined on keeping their routine long term, like really long term. If the INFJs and the INTJs are the master planners, then the ISTJs and ISFJs are the master preservers. If they want to get forward as much as possible, ISTJs and ISFJs like to be consistent. So you typically won't see them talking about a lot of grand plans. And if you do, they're typically more grounded and more practical. Like, obviously, ISTJs think about the future because they like logistics. All of the SJ types like logistics. They like to know where everything is, what are their surroundings going to look like. But in the case of the ISTJs and ISFJs, they just want to be safe. They want to think, okay, there have been strategies employed in the past, and these strategies have protected me, so I want to preserve my own existence as much as possible. That's why they typically put a lot of emphasis on health. They like the doctors, they like the people that'll help keep them on the right path. They have a fondness for rules because those rules have been established strategies in the past. So a lot of times you won't get ISTJs liking to break rules, and they'll often be the ones quoting the rules to you if you break them. Not so much the ISFJs because they have extroverted feeling, but we'll talk about them another day if I ever feel like it. What makes ISTJs so good at being loyal and dedicated and rule loving is their secondary function, extroverted thinking. This is also the secondary function for INTJs. And so those two types like to think about what is efficient, what is the best and most practical way of getting a job done. In the case of the INTJs, they might be more likely to create a system of efficiency, whereas an ISTJ is going to preserve a system of efficiency. Typically, ISTJs are really hard workers and can be a bit of a perfectionist. They love to make sure to get everything done exactly how protocol demands it. They don't typically like to employ new strategies or try to innovate in the work field. Typically, if their boss tells them to do something, they'll do it. However, with it being extroverted thinking, it can have kind of a bossy undertone to it, as they are so certain about what works and how things should be that they can sometimes belittle or insult people if they just don't see the common theme. Like, how can you people be so stupid? That's usually what goes in through their heads. They don't mean to be insulting, they just want society to function. Unlike the ESTJs and the ENTJs, ISTJs typically aren't comfortable being leaders. That's why the extroverted thinking is slightly lower, because their introverted sensing makes them want to preserve that comfort. And being a leader involves dealing with people dynamics, which are more subjective by design because people have ever-changing emotions and needs and requires you to be adaptable to the situation. ISTJs do not like being adaptable. They like to think that their routine and their Groundhog Day way of living is what's going to make them happy. So being a leader might involve stepping out of the routine, and that'll make them upset and uncomfortable. However, with it still being relatively high, ISTJs like everything to be objective. Obviously, there's going to be some subjectivity in the ISTJ's reasoning because they have introverted feeling tertiary. And so all of the IJ and EP types are going to be relatively balanced with their logic and their emotions. But ISTJs are going to prefer looking at what is factual and what is definitively able to be proven. They often talk down on the TP and FJ types because they use introverted thinking. They don't like the idea of using an internal logical framework to figure things out. They want the answer, not your answer, not my answer, not the world's answer, but what is absolutely definitively 100% true, can't be made up. They often don't like the idea of toleration. They like to think there is only one truth and everyone should follow it. The problem is that you have to be convinced that the truth is the truth with your feelings. So I think there's always going to be some level of slight hypocrisy because they might say, oh, I'm being perfectly objective. I'm going by science. I'm going by all of these facts. But sometimes they don't fact check, or sometimes they are biased in which sources they get the facts from. So then there's a little bit of subjectivity there. But I think the average ISTJ is going to probably be a contributing force in the battle against postmodernism, because there are so many people out there that seem to say truth is relative and you're entitled to your opinion. And while if there's something that truly is opinion based, like favorite colors, for example, there is no objective answer, ISTJs are going to want to take that which does have an objective answer and use it as a means of their decision making. So for instance, the law of gravity, that's not really something you can make up. Sure, you could say that maybe the law of gravity has been miscalculated, but you can't deny that there is a law. And in the same way, ISTJs are going to want to look at that kind of principle of there being a law of consistency to just about everything. That's why they make really good lawyers, for instance, because they love looking through evidence to prove definitively this is what happened. This isn't just my opinion. These aren't just my feelings on my client. I am presenting the truth. I probably would have been a lawyer in another life, but as it stands, certain elements in my personal life made that really hard. I do really like detective games and attorney games because I love being able to use my brain to be able to solve the crime, but instead of using my own internal reasoning, I like to look at the evidence and see what actually happened. And that's why I'm not an ISTP, because I am going to look at the evidence, the empirical data, the statistics, the collected wisdom of people that know better. And that's why it's extroverted thinking. Another thing I've noticed about extroverted thinkers is that they tend to think out loud quite a lot more than the introverted thinkers. So typically if you ask an ISTJ a question about what they think about something, they're going to give an answer pretty quickly, because to them, extroverted thinking can kind of make them come across as a bit more adaptable than most J types do. This is true for all of the TJ and FP types. They all tend to be able to give very quick answers, but when it comes to emotions, ISTJs are a bit slower to react to that, and that's where we get into the tertiary function. The third function of both the ISTJ and the INTJ is introverted feeling. Introverted feeling means that these types have a very strong sense of personal morals and personal feelings that they use to make decisions when objectivity simply can't give you an answer. Emotions like, how do I feel about the issue? What are my personal convictions about what this means? Makes it so that ISTJs are quite emotionally driven by thinking type standards. They do have a certain degree of subjectivity that they actually like having. And a lot of times I've noticed for me, this plays out as me liking to be unique, liking to have my preferences and my likes and dislikes be a part of who I am and how I express myself. Like this shirt, for example. I like the world to know, hey, I like Zelda. This is something that I love. My introverted feeling is going crazy on this. But not just when it comes to things that I like movies and video games. Also in terms of my quirks, my habits, everything weird about me, I don't want to hide it and be like everyone else. Typically, ISTJs make fun of the FJ types because their extroverted feeling makes them want to blend in and fit in with the crowd, whereas ISTJs hate following the crowd. If anything, they want to rebel and say, we are individuals, we are going to do it our way, while at the same time still following the rules. So that's yet another example of a bit of hypocrisy, where they want to be objective and they want to follow the rules, but they also want to be authentically themselves. They want to always tell the truth and they expect everyone else to tell the truth. So if you tell a lie to the ISTJ, they'll say, why were you fabricating the truth? And then that'll actually hurt their feelings, because to an ISTJ, nothing hurts them more than the truth being obfuscated. So if you're, say, for example, giving the ISTJ the silent treatment because it offended them, they're going to be even more offended by that than you actually pointing out what they did wrong, because they're going to say, how could you have been letting me get away with breaking the rules and being discourteous all this time? You are actively contributing in me being a worse person because you couldn't man or woman up to tell me the truth. So if you really want to get on an ISTJ's bad side, just be a pathological liar. That's like one of the things that ISTJs hate the most is lying, disorganization, and chaos are like the three big things I would say. However, introverted feeling also has an interesting side effect for the ISTJs and INTJs, with it being in the tertiary. And that's that they don't always like expressing that side of them very much. Typically, ISTJs get a reputation for being a bit of a deadpan or robotic type of personality. They typically don't show a lot of animated facial expressions, and their body language is relatively minimal. I'm kind of the exception to that rule. But we typically don't like expressing what we're really feeling about things unless if we really trust a person, or if we do it in some kind of creative way, like in a song or a novel. So you typically will even have husbands and wives where if one of the members of the couple is an ISTJ, that person will typically take a lot of years, even with an established marriage, to be able to say, yeah, this is making me sad. But it's not that they don't think about their emotions. They're actually very well in tune with their emotions, even more so than some other feeling types. Because whereas the FJ types might consider other people's feelings, they won't think enough about their own emotions. ISTJs are constantly thinking about how they feel. And inwardly, they're probably a bunch of drama queens. All of the TJ and FP types are considerably more dramatic than the TP and FJ types. But ISTJs don't like to let their emotions overtake their ability to be rational and objective. To them, they see emotions as kind of on a when needed basis, like okay, right now is not the time to let my emotions go, but maybe another time. Let me just assess the situation first, figure out if I can ascertain the person's trustworthiness, and then I'll say, okay, now I give myself permission to be dramatic. For me, I know one kind of unfortunate habit that I have is I ask people's permission for how much emotions I'm allowed to give, because I am terrible at reading people, which you're about to find out in the shadow functions list. And so by letting other people set the rules for how much I'm allowed to show, that can help me not have to guess and not have to intuit all of these personal feelings and just say, okay, you said I could just share all my emotions, so I'm just going to spew out everything I feel. And then that ends up hurting people's feelings anyway because they were like, oh shoot, that was offensive. And I'm like, well, why didn't you just say so? If you want an ISTJ to be more honest with their emotions, you got to be willing to accept all of it. ISTJs have just as complex of feelings as any of the FP types do, and they need to let it out, not only because it's scientifically supported that it's healthy to express your emotions, but also because if they think about their emotions too much, it can lead them to making horrible decisions, and it can even cause them to think falsehoods about themselves. This is especially exacerbated, is that the right word? When you look at their inferior function, extroverted intuition, which is typically a function used to gather ideas and think about new possibilities, new ways of looking at things. If introverted intuition is more like a drill trying to get deeper to the core of the earth, then extroverted intuition is more like a spider web where it keeps reaching outward, trying to grab this idea and this concept and that sensory detail and mesh it all together to find something creative. Typically, ISTJs are secretly really creative, but they often don't like to actually employ any of those ideas for practical use because their inferior function is typically known as the fearful or aspiration function, which means that deep down inside, ISTJs really want to be silly and they want to be like the goofiest person in the world, while at the same time, it also means that they're afraid of new possibilities. Typically, ISTJs don't like going past old-fashioned stuff. They tend to see if this has worked in the past, then it's always going to work. Why should we change just for the sake of change? To them, it goes against their routine and makes them feel unsafe. They also don't like being in environments where there are too many unknown factors, so it might really tire them out when they're around the ENFPs and ENTPs because those types are constantly wanting to innovate and coming up with new ideas. And the ISTJ is like, oh, I can't even keep track of all of that. If an ISTJ has developed their extroverted intuition, they can turn into really good comedians. They might have like a song or a book that has some really out there concepts that no one else has heard of so that they'll be less of a copycat. But at the same time, when an ISTJ is under stress, their extroverted intuition and introverted feeling can make them over catastrophize the what ifs in life, and it can make them blame themselves for all of these possibilities. ISTJs are typically pretty harsh on other people for what they think is the right thing, but they apply that same harshness to themselves. And most of the outer world considers them to be too harsh. In fact, I think the main critique that I get from my friends in general is, wow, Paul, you are way too hard on yourselves. You need to give yourself a metaphorical pat on the back way more often because you're actually way more talented and way more creative than you give yourself credit for. A lot of times I'll often say like, yeah, my books are absolute garbage and no one deserves to read those messes. Or I might like downplay my achievements and people say like, no, that's something to be proud of. Why are you downplaying it? Of course, I have my reasons for saying all that. Part of it could be PTSD, but part of it is also that, like, extroverted intuition focuses on the what ifs as opposed to the introverted intuition focusing on what will be. So, any type with extroverted intuition, which are the NP and SJ types, all of those types are going to think about what could happen. So, they're really good at envisioning possibilities. ISTJs envision negative possibilities most of the time. So unlike the ENFPs and ENTPs where they get this big grin on their face when they come up with a new idea, ISTJs have the exact opposite problem where they're like, oh no, this new technology is coming and we're all doomed because AI is going to take over the world because it's a new thing and we can't have that. That's why they're thinking of all the possibilities of what could happen if they unleash their creativity. And so I think if you want an ISTJ to get more developed with extroverted intuition, you have to ensure them that the possibilities that they are seeing are more of unlikely possibilities, and even if they were to be possible, that they're not as dangerous as the ISTJs making out in their head because they're inferior intuitives. They don't have the amazing foresight that the dominant ones do. So a lot of times I have to ask my friends, how do you think this scenario will play out? Can you provide me with the logistics and the details? And can you read this person's intentions? Because I can't. And typically that helps me to feel like I can show off my comedic side a bit more. I think I've succeeded so much that there's a running joke going on between me and Isabel that this one particular YouTuber, won't give any names just in case, but he thought I was an ENFP. And it's because the video in question where he got that assumption was that Isabel and I went to meet each other in 2022 and we were playing a Would You Rather. And because I was animated and expressive, sometimes I would interject to tell a joke, that came across as being an ENFP. And while every type has a subconscious type, which is basically your opposite letter type, I think I was just tapping into my ENFP subconscious so much that he thought ISTJ was the subconscious. And while it's a very long and involved discussion to try to explain why that wouldn't be, the short answer is that according to the Linda Barron's type measurement system, ISTJs are concrete, ENFPs are abstract. So a true ENFP would use a lot more metaphors and figures of speech because their intuition is all the way up here, whereas ISTJs are going to make fun of those kinds of manners of speech. And there are quite a few times where I take someone's statement very, very literally. And that's typically something you don't hear a lot from the higher up intuitives. They'll be like, oh, that just made me cringe because that is not what I was intending at all. Now let's move on to the shadow functions, which are more of the unconscious side. If the ENFP side is the subconscious, then the unconscious is more like the INFJ or the ESTP or like whatever types have the completely opposite function stack. So let's start out with extroverted sensing. Now, I mentioned this in my INFJ video, but the fifth function is often described as the admiration function, where the type can sometimes enjoy elements of this function, but they won't want it to be their go-to course of action. So for the ISTJ, extroverted sensing might make them crave sensory, pleasurable experiences, but they're not going to want to do it all the time. They're going to want to make sure it's in a carefully calculated manner so that there's as little risk as possible. So for instance, when I went to visit Isabel, some of you might be thinking that that's a super brave and amazing usage of extroverted intuition because that is not part of your routine at all. You had to go to a whole different state just to see her and follow along with all these different sets of rules. I asked a lot of questions about logistics and travel time and expenses. I wanted to know all of the little details. So I couldn't truly live in the moment because I was afraid of just simply enjoying the senses as they came. So while yes, it was fun to have that novel experience, I'm not going to want to be constantly doing that kind of stuff. In the same way that I went to a water park after I, 3 water parks to be exact, after I got over my fear of the water, but like I'm not going to be terribly upset if I'm not constantly going to the water park. Another thing is the fifth function can sometimes be called the opposing function, which means that it runs counter to your dominant mode of thinking, and the types that use it in the dominant can often come across as an opposite. So for example, the ESFPs and the ESTPs leading with extroverted sensing live in the moment, very much aware of what sensory tangible things are happening right here, right now, disconnected from the past or the future. ISTJs with their introverted sensing are constantly thinking about the past and how it compares to what is right in front of them, whereas an ESFP and an ESTP wouldn't do that. So the ISTJ might have a very hard time, even if they do get outside their comfort zone and try some kind of sensory pleasurable activity, they might still lack the ability to truly see it as it is without either comparing it to something in the past or thinking something terrible will happen in the future. So there's typically a very lose-lose situation with whatever they're noticing, and that's why they're not the SP types. Next we have introverted thinking, which is the can sometimes come out in strong bursts function but is still not very much a go-to function. So for the ISTJ, they can do relatively well when it comes to reasoning and deconstructing the why and stuff. I know for me, like, I really like researching why things are the way that they are, but I think in my case, I research why society does so many stupid things as opposed to truly needing to understand the logical principle behind something. To me, logical principles don't matter unless if they are required for understanding the facts of a situation, whereas a TP type would only be thinking about logical consistency, and if it didn't make sense to them, then they wanted to completely discard it. Whereas I can acknowledge that there are things in this world that aren't logically consistent, but that's not going to bother me as long as it makes sense, or not makes sense, as long as it's factual and as long as it coincides with my routine. So I can occasionally have really good insights. Like if I'm debating with someone, I might like have a very strong logical argument, or I might be able to say like, I can see where your reasoning is kind of flimsy there, but I'm typically not going to be very good at it. I'm not going to want to be put in those kinds of situations. I actually don't really like arguing at all because I feel like what an argument is both sides having their version of the truth and trying to bash heads over which person actually sees the truth. And I see that as a waste of time because if people were more objective, we wouldn't need to have arguments and we wouldn't have all these people having all these different opinions. It drives me insane. I think that's why I'm not a TP type because I want the facts. I don't want to just rely on my own internal reasoning because my own internal reasoning could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, then it's a waste of time to entertain something that is blatantly false. Now we get into the bottom two, which is where some of you might want to, how do I word this? Some of you might want to hurl a bunch of insults at me because the bottom two functions are what really makes a type look like an absolute buffoon when they try to use it and how weak they are in it. So for the ISTJ, their weakest function, even though it's the seventh and not the eighth, is extroverted feeling. A true extroverted feeling type, which are the FJ and TP types, will be very aware of people's emotions and will try to create a harmonious atmosphere where as many people's feelings are respected as possible. With extroverted feeling being in the blind spot, ISTJs don't pay attention to people's emotions and feelings. They don't pay attention to what will create harmony, and instead, they're so concerned with always telling the truth and being so straightforward and never giving a false answer that they don't consider how their words and their actions are going to affect another person emotionally. So they can come across as unintentionally harsh and insulting when they're not trying to do that. They're either trying to be constructive or they're just talking and people somehow take that as an insult. I know for me, like one of the biggest examples of when I clearly demonstrated my lack of extroverted feeling was when my brother was recently married. This was like 6 years ago, so recently married at that time. And he was talking about like all of his plans for the future. He's like, now that I'm married, I'm going to have this many kids and I'm going to have this kind of a house. And when I have kids, he was using a lot of when this happens. He didn't say like any ifs or anything like that. And I said, well, are you sure you're going to be able to have kids? Because you know that the woman's fertility cycle is extremely situational and there are high probabilities of your wife possibly miscarrying, so maybe it would be a good idea if you don't get your hopes up too much. He was super offended by that. But I didn't know that he was offended because he didn't outright tell me. My mom told me that he told her, and then she said, maybe you might want to apologize to him. And I was like, oh dear, yep, I blew it. I shouldn't have just been the scientific nerd. I should have been more sensitive to his feelings, and even worse, I probably should have realized that he was fearing that very possibility and just didn't want to verbalize it, and I brought back the feelings of anxiety that he was already having. So I think what I do to try to overcompensate for that weakness is I pay attention to rules and social norms and store them in my database of my brain with my introverted sensing so that I can say, oh, wait a minute, 6 years ago, I made a blunder by talking about a woman's fertility cycle. Let's not do that again. so that I don't have to embarrass myself and hurt people's feelings. Whereas an FJ type probably wouldn't need to do that because they just naturally make those guesses, especially if they're an INFJ or an ENFJ because they have the intuition so high. I also like to look at what does the church teach on emotions and compassion and caring. And that also is sort of a fail-safe to avoid me from my pitfall of not having enough extroverted feeling. An, the final tip I can think of how I've learned to overcompensate is whenever I encounter a new scenario with a person, I will always ask, what are the person's boundaries and what bothers them? The answer that I hate, absolutely hate hearing. Take note of this, guys, because this is one of my biggest pet peeves is, well, I can't think of anything that'll bother me right now. So why don't you just talk, and if something you say bothers you, then we'll address it when we get to it. No, tell me now, because I am going to probably really hurt your feelings because I usually tell it like it is. I don't have a lot of tact or prudence in how I preserve my speech. I'm sure I've made plenty of offensive remarks and jokes throughout the entirety of this channel, and over time I can probably see where I might have stepped over the metaphorical line, but I certainly wasn't intending to offend people. I was just speaking what I thought was the truth. And so the truth should be prepared ahead of time. Like, I don't think I would ever have a problem being able to express my boundaries right away. I can only think of one time in recent memory when I legitimately thought, oh, yes, that is a boundary. But I think in that case, it wasn't a fact that I didn't realize I was offended, but it was more so that I hadn't realized that I hadn't told that person that it was a boundary. So I think for me, like, when I'm upset or offended by someone, I typically store it in my mental database so that I never forget it. So when I encounter people and we're meeting for the first time, I will say, okay, don't talk about needles, don't talk about hospitals, don't talk about anything to do with marriage or weddings or any of that stuff. Don't lie. Always keep your promises. Try to respond in a punctual manner. Don't stretch the truth, don't ghost. Like, I have this very clear list of boundaries, and that is what I wish others would do so that I don't have to keep making all of these blunders and embarrassing myself and then remembering it 20 years later and stopping in my tracks on the sidewalk being like, oh, great, I did that all those years ago. Yes, that really does happen. I'm not exaggerating. There have been times where I will like vividly recall something I did like in my childhood and worrying about how that person is going to perceive me now if they were to see me again. And thankfully, my sister and my parents are like, Paul, no one remembers stuff as good as you. They're too immersed in their own problems to pay attention to all that. So that does make me feel slightly better. Finally, we have introverted intuition, which is the demon function. Introverted intuitives, especially the INFJs and the INTJs, where they use it in the dominant, love to think about the future. They love to look deeper at something. They especially love to reach their personal goals. So for me, I'm not typically very good at looking at something other than either what it is or how it has been. For me, like, I have a hard time following along with philosophy, and I have a hard time following along with like theories, and basically anything abstract is just really annoying to me. I don't like using a whole lot of figures of speech, and if I do, I cringe because I'm like, oh, that's not literally what I mean, but like it's more effective to say it because American language is so stupid. But typically speaking, ISTJs aren't going to want to think too far ahead. And if they do think ahead, it's going to be for a foreseeable outcome, as opposed to a completely new and far-fetched scenario. Typically, ISTJs are not going to want to look ahead to something that has too many maybes associated with it. Like, for instance, the more advanced intuitive types that maybe still live with their parents might be thinking about a contingency plan for when the parents die. Granted, it sometimes crosses my mind, like, okay, what if my parents die tomorrow? But I don't actively make plans about it because I figured that there are too many unknown variables that could happen. I think all of the intuitive types could probably learn a thing or two from COVID happening because no one anticipated having to live through a pandemic in modern times. We all thought that was a thing in like the 1800s, and modern medicine had advanced enough so that not only were pandemics unheard of, but most people didn't even know what a pandemic was until either they played Zero Time Dilemma or they experienced COVID. And for me, had I known that COVID was a reality, that would have changed a lot of my plans. But because no one knew how to handle such a situation, all of that planning before COVID didn't matter. So in the same way, there could be something else that could completely baffle the whole world that would screw over my plans, and it would have been a waste of time for me to even theorize about that stuff because that unknown variable came into play. For example, now there's this whole debate about AI. So there is so many dangerous things that could happen with AI that could potentially ruin some of my plans that were put into effect before AI became such an advanced feature. And I had never heard of such technology until just a couple of months ago, and I'm still really learning about it because I don't like to watch the news because news is often biased and it doesn't report the facts, it reports opinions. And so it doesn't make sense to me to try to plan for something so far in advance when so much could happen so far in advance. What if I break a leg? And then now all of my plans about getting more hours at work are dashed because, well, I can't work as hard if I can't work as effectively. So to the ISTJ, trying to think deeper, trying to think too far in advance is just a waste of time because their dominant functions see too many other possibilities. Is it possible for an ISTJ to develop introverted intuition? The only thing I can think of off the top of my head is if the ISTJs start to think about patterns that typically have been used in the past to figure out how an event was going to take place. Like maybe they can map out assassinations of presidents in advance so that maybe they can foresee if something else will happen. Not that I'm thinking about that actively, but maybe like if they're a security guard, they could watch old footage of like, okay, when Kennedy was assassinated, this is what the room looked like, and this is where the security were. So if I can adjust the security so that the line of sight from the shotgun is perfectly positioned, then we won't have any need for panic for assassination because we've got it covered. That sounds like way too much work, but I think that's really the only realistic solution that I can think of, is just give them the logistics to be able to predict the future. Then hopefully that'll help them with more unknown scenarios, but I doubt it because it's the demon function. And INFJs and INTJs are going to forever make fun of us because we just can't seem to predict that darn pesky future. With that, I have gone way longer than I intended, so I am sorry if I bored all of you. Hopefully you learned a thing or two about how the ISTJ works. If you're an ISTJ, comment anything, well, something constructive. I don't want just the usual great video, W, ooh, like, no. I want an actual constructive thought. Like, even if it's short, at least put some thought into it. I know you're an introvert, I can relate, but don't be too much of an introvert where you're so abrupt that it's like, that's hardly anything to go by. If you're not an ISTJ, what do you think? Do you relate to any of these functions? If you're an INFJ, ENFJ, ESTP, or ISTP, are you like, man, these ISTJs are confusing because they share none of our functions? Either way, let me know. Love reading and responding to your comments, so please feel free to blab away, because that's exactly what I would do if I were in your comments section. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat, and until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!